In this lab, I'm going to show you how we can integrate both Cortex and MISP with TheHive. Sit back and let's jump straight in. Hello everyone, I'm Lyle and welcome to my channel. In this lab session, we're going to continue where we left off with our SOC installation, and I'm going to show you how to integrate and link Cortex and MISP to TheHive. Just a quick recap. In the previous video, I showed you how to use Docker Compose and containers to set up TheHive, Cortex, and MISP, as well as the supporting services and databases required to make these three services work. If you haven't already, it's advised that you watch the previous videos first so that what I'm about to show you makes the most sense. So you may be asking, why are we integrating Cortex and MISP with TheHive? Well, with our current SOC setup, TheHive, Cortex, and MISP are essentially all standalone services at this point. We could create a case in TheHive and manually query the gathered observables like IP addresses, domain names, hashes against the Cortex analyzers and MISP. While this may work, it's not the most efficient way of carrying out this process. When dealing with security incidents, response times are key, and therefore integrating and automating our SOC as much as possible is not only important to save time, but so that us as cybersecurity professionals can focus on the interesting things and less on the mundane, time-consuming tasks. By the end of this lab, we will have full integration and synchronization between these services, so that later in the series, when we explore Cortex analyzers and simulate incidents and create cases within TheHive, that we can trigger both Cortex and MISP analysis directly from the TheHive dashboard. In addition to this, we will be able to receive and filter alerts directly from MISP in the TheHive dashboard and have the ability to send intelligence we gather back to the MISP, essentially sharing our findings with others if we wish to allow this functionality. So to make this integration possible, we firstly need to complete some basic configurations in both MISP and Cortex. So to start, you need to open a terminal to your server that's running the Docker containers, and you need to make sure that all of your services and containers are online by running the Docker Compose up command like I showed you in the previous video. So we're just going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to use the -D mode, which is the detached mode, so that the startup of these containers can all run in the background. And you'll see that all of our containers have been successfully created and are in the process of starting up in the background. Once everything is spun up, we'll start by accessing TheHive. So let's log in using the default username and password, which is admin@thehive.local, and the password is secret. And then once we're in TheHive, I just want to quickly show you here, if we go to the platform management settings, you'll see that we're running on the community license. There are various other licensing options which are available. However, for the lab, we'll just be sticking with the community licensing options. And then I just wanted to show you, if we go to Cortex, you'll see that the functionality is unavailable, and the same applies for MISP. So we're going to move over to the MISP dashboard, once again using the browser. And in my case, the IP address for that server is 10.200.200.253. And we'll be prompted with this login page. The IP address may be different for you depending on what you set up in the previous video where we covered the installation of MISP. So the default login here is admin@admintest. And the password is just admin, and we'll log in. And then on the initial login, MISP will always prompt us to do a password change. So it's pretty straightforward here. We just need to supply the new password. Just something to keep in mind, MISP requires the password to be 12 characters long and to contain both numbers, symbols, and letters, capital and lowercase. So I'm going to quickly set up a password. We'll just repeat it. And we'll confirm the old password, which is admin, and we will then say submit. So once logged in, you'll see that MISP will show you your profile page. This is just the default admin profile, which comes pre-installed with MISP. However, for our installation, we're going to be setting up a new organization and a new user to use. So we're going to head over to administration at the top, and we're going to go to add organizations. Then within this form, it's pretty straightforward to fill in. It's a local organization. We're then going to give our organization an identifier. So since all these labs are based around the fictional company Morgan Maxwell, we're going to then be using Morgan Maxwell as our organization. So we'll just type that in. And for the UUID, we can just automatically generate that by clicking the Generate UUID. And you can give it some brief information here if you wish. And you can bind user accounts to it if you want as well. The choice is obviously yours. And then you can even upload a image for your company logo or something along those lines, and provide all these extra details. But for our lab, I'm just going to leave this as default, and we're going to submit. You'll then see that MISP will just show you the final setup and give you sort of a summary of what we've just done. So here's all the information that we've just created. The next step is we need to create a user account that is tied to the Morgan Maxwell organization. So in order to do that, it's back to the administration at the top, and then we're going to be adding a user. And then MISP requires us to use an email address format when we create these accounts. So we're just going to use, we'll just have it as lab user at mm.local. So we'll just have as morganmaxwell.local. And we'll set a password for that. Once again, has to follow the minimum length of 12 characters like we did earlier. So we'll quickly set that up. And then we're going to choose the organization that we just set up, which was Morgan Maxwell. We're then going to say that this is a org admin. However, if we're setting up different users, we could change this depending on the level of restriction and accessibility that user needs to have within MISP. However, we're just going to have this as an org admin. We don't have to worry about the PGP key, and we'll create the user. So now that the user has been created, the final step of the configuration in MISP is we're going to need to create a auth key. Basically, the auth key is what makes all this integration between TheHive and Cortex and so forth possible. And we're going to need to use it in our configuration when we set up both Cortex and TheHive later on. So in order to set up this auth key, we can then come over to the Actions section and then click on this little view icon. And it'll take us into the user that we just created, which is lab user at mm.local. And if we come right down to the bottom, you'll see there's this auth keys link here. And once we're in there, we can then say add authentication key. Then what it'll do is it'll select the user that we just set up there. And you can put any comments in if you need to, and then you can also set this up if you want to allow certain IPs to use this auth key. Because this is within our lab environment, I'm not going to put that level of restriction in place. However, the option is there if you would like to limit which IP addresses or which incoming IP addresses are allowed to authenticate using this auth key. And then it also gives us an option to set up an expiration date should we wish to do that. And then also a read-only token. So it is what it is. It will only be able to read the content. It won't be able to post content back into MISP. So once you're happy with all that, we'll just click submit. And then the auth key has been created. So what you need to do is you need to copy this auth key down, put it into a notepad, because this is the only opportunity that you'll ever get to see this particular auth key. Once we've noted this, we'll never be able to see it again. We'll only see a partial view of this particular key. So I'm going to just copy this out of here and then put it into a notepad, because we're going to need that later on in the configuration. And then you can just select I've noted the key down, take me back now. And then we're done with that. If we go back to the auth keys, then you'll see now we have for lab user an auth key, and then it has this partial view of what that auth key is, and that it's all set up and we're ready to go with it. So now that we've completed these steps in MISP, we need to follow similar steps in Cortex. So we'll head over to our Cortex admin dashboard. And then we're going to be logging in here with the username and password that we created in the previous lab video. So we'll type that in. And we'll click sign in. Now we're in our admin dashboard. So Cortex comes with a default Cortex organization pre-installed with this Docker. However, like we did for MISP, we're going to have to add our own organization. So we're simply going to click on add organization, and we're going to give it a name. We just follow what we did with the previous setup in MISP. We'll call it Morgan Maxwell. And we can give it a description if we want to. We'll just call it Morgan Maxwell again. Give it its full name, which was Morgan Maxwell real estate, and we'll save. And you'll see then we have that second organization that will appear in the list. So now that the organization is being created, we need to add a user and also create an API key that we'll use later on in this configuration. So to do that, we're going to head over to users top right. You'll see there's our previously created user. However, we're going to create a new one and add it to the Morgan Maxwell organization. So the login for this, in this case, we'll call it lab user at mm.local. And the full name, we'll just say lab user. And then we're going to select the organization from the dropdown, which was Morgan Maxwell. And the role, we're going to give this read, analyze, and org admin. And then we will say or click the save user option button. And then you'll see that lab user at mm.local has been added. So the next step is we're quickly going to set up a password for this user. So we'll just click on new password and we'll put our password in there. And we'll hit enter, and you'll see that at the bottom left will say that it's been successfully updated. And then the final step is to create the API key. So we're going to click on create API key. And then once it's done that, you'll be able to select reveal and you'll be able to see the API key. I suggest that you copy this down, put it into a notepad along with your API key that we created in MISP previously, as we're going to need both of those in the coming steps. Now that we've created our organizations, users, and API keys, we need to take all the Docker containers offline and revisit the docker compose.yaml file to make some amendments and additions to complete the integration process. As always, I will include the links to these steps as well as the changes to the Docker compose and config files and I'll post that up on my blog for you guys to have a look at. So to take the Docker containers offline, we're going to then type in docker compose down, and then this will gracefully shut down all of the containers. If you have initially run Docker Compose and you haven't used the detached mode, you just simply use Control-C, and it will also gracefully bring all the Docker containers down. And then once everything's done, it'll take you back to the command line. So I've opened up Visual Studio Code so we can have a look at the Docker Compose YAML file. It's a little bit easier to read here than what it is using Nano. So the first changes that we're going to be having to make is we're going to have to update our version to 3.7. In the previous video, we were using version 3. However, I had some issues with version 3 where it was not mapping the volumes the way that I intended for it to do. So this needed to be updated to 3.7. Then the second change that we need to make here is we need to scroll down to the command section, and we need to comment out the no configs Cortex line, because we are now going to in fact give it a configuration to use. And then we need to uncomment Cortex port, and then the port which is 9001, and then Cortex keys, and then the Cortex key just below that. So from the previous step, we saved that Cortex key. So you're going to basically just take that key that you saved earlier, and you're going to then copy it into this line over here. And then finally, we need to change the volume section to TheHive conf application.conf, and then we need to map it to etc TheHive application.conf. For this to work correctly, we need to use a relative path like I've done over here, and you need to make sure that the Hive config application.conf directory and the config files need to be located within the Docker Compose parent directory, or else you're going to run into issues where Docker Compose creates a application.conf directory instead of a application.conf file like we intended to do, and your integration will completely fail. So you need to make sure that wherever you have your Docker Compose file, that you create this file structure directly in there, or else this will completely fail. That's also one of the main reasons why I changed to version 3.7, because I couldn't get the relative file paths to work correctly with version 3 for whatever reason, but at least it solved the problem there. So we're going to head back to our terminal, and then we're going to be setting up those volume directories in the application.conf file. So to do this, you're going to navigate to wherever your Docker Compose file is. In my case, it's home Docker Lab Docker Compose. And then we're going to be creating a directory structure here like I described previously. So we'll use makedir, and we will then create TheHive/conf. Then what we'll do is we are going to change to that directory, and we're going to be using Nano to create the application.conf file. Hit enter. So I've quickly switched back to the Visual Studio Code. I just want to show you what this application.conf looks like. So this is the one that I've set up according to the Hive configuration documentation, where we have to specify which module we want to use. So in this case, it's play.modules.enable, and then we want to enable the hive.connector misp.misp module. Just a quick rundown of how this works. We're going to give it a name. We're going to call it MISP. I just also want to mention that with the interval, that just determines how frequently MISP needs to synchronize with the Hive. So that variable can be set to 1 hour or less, or whatever your desired setting is. And then we're going to give it a name, and we're going to call it MISP, and we're going to then point it to the MISP container. So with Docker Compose, you can directly use the container name. In this case, it was MISP, like we set up in our previous Docker container file. You can see we called it MISP. If you have a custom bridge network set up like we did with the soc.net, then you can directly call MISP or any other container name as if it was a DNS name. It does the resolution, the DNS resolution within that custom Docker network for us. So in this case, I'm telling the application.config to go and look for that MISP container. And then it asks us what sort of authentication we want to use. So in this case, we're going to be using the key, and then we are going to be copying in the key that we created earlier in this lab from MISP. We'll place that in here. And then with these tags and case templates and so forth, we're going to just leave this in as a placeholder for now. But we will be using the tags later on in the configuration when we want to filter what we would like to allow to be sent from MISP into the Hive. So the way that this integration is going to work is MISP is going to give us a whole lot of intelligence and alerts and feeds and so forth. And then we can then use this config to filter what we want to see in the Hive. And this is ideal because MISP can become overwhelming with the amount of alerts and intelligence and so forth that it provides us. So there may be certain specific tags that we want to look at. So we can create a whitelist here where we can use where we can specify the tags that we want to use. In this case, we're just going to leave those as placeholders. This configuration I intend to cover in more detail in the next video. So we're going to then copy this application.conf file, and we are going to then head back to our terminal. And then once we're back at the terminal, we're just going to then paste that in over here, and you'll hit Control X and Y for yes to save, enter again. And then we have a configuration file created with the API key that we set up earlier from MISP, as well as pointing this particular Hive configuration file to the MISP server. We're then going to head back to our Docker Compose folder. And then we just need to go quickly make those changes to the Docker Compose YAML file. So it was version 3.7. We then needed to uncomment the Cortex port, and we needed to comment the no config Cortex out. We needed to uncomment Cortex keys, and then we'll just need to copy that Cortex key again from Notepad. Then the volumes, we just need to change from the previous configuration. So that will be Hive config, and then the mapping is like we want it to be exactly. And then we're going to hit Control X and Y, and we're going to save the file, and then we're good to go with that. So once we've made the configuration changes, we are then going to bring Docker back online again. So that's Docker Compose up, and then I'm going to run it in the detached mode again. We'll hit enter, and then it creates the network bridge and all the Docker containers, and then in the background all the Dockers will come up. We'll leave it for a minute or two before we try to access them again. So now that the Hive is back online, we're going to open up our web browser, and we're going to log into the admin dashboard again. So it's just the admin at thehive.local, and the password is secret. We'll click let me in. And then we are going to head over to the platform management settings again. And I just quickly want to show you here that we now have MISP servers 1 of 1 and Cortex servers 1 of 1 set up. And then if we go to Cortex, you'll see now that we have all this information included here. If we click on it, we'll be able to see Cortex along with the API key that we set up earlier. And then we can head over to MISP and you'll see the same setup over here where we'll have a MISP server. There's just one setting that we need to change to make this work 100%, and that is to disable, or rather enable, this option where it says do not check the certificate authority. And we're going to click update and then confirm. Now, the main reason why we need to do that is because the MISP creates a self-signed certificate and the Hive does not trust that self-signed certificate, so we have to then just tell it to ignore it. If you were running this in a production environment, you'd most likely have your own certificate authority or something that you could set up, like a let's encrypt certificate or something along those lines, where that would be a trusted certificate. However, for this lab setup, we're not going to worry too much about that. And then the final thing I just want to show you here is if we look at the bottom left-hand side, you'll see we have these two icons. One has an icon with the Cortex logo in and the other one with the MISP icon. And you'll see they both have a green ring around them. This basically just means that they are online and that they're synchronized and that they're functioning correctly. If any of these services were to go down for whatever reason, there'll be a red ring around it indicating that there's a problem with it. So while we're in the Hive, the final step that we're going to be doing for this part of the lab is just to set up a organization within the Hive as well as a user. So we will go to our organizations and then we'll click on the little plus icon to add the organization. We're going to give it a name. We're just going to call it Morgan Maxwell. And the description, we can just leave it as anything we want, but let's put in Morgan Maxwell. And then we'll just leave these task sharing rules and observable sharing rules to be manual at this stage. And we'll click confirm. And then you'll see that the Morgan Maxwell organization has been created. And then we're going to head over to users. And you'll see this is our default admin user. However, we want to create a user and tie it into that Morgan Maxwell organization. So we'll once again click add user. We're just going to leave this as a normal user. You can set this up as a service user as well if you need to specifically use it for like a bot or any sort of API call. However, we're going to log in with this user. It's going to be our main user. And we're going to give our username a login name. So we're just going to call it lab user at mm.local. We'll use the name lab user again. And then we're going to tie it into the Morgan Maxwell organization. And then we've got some roles here. So we can set it up as an analyst, an org admin, or read only. In this case, we're just going to have it as our org admin. And then we're going to say confirm. And then you'll see that that user account has been created. Final step, we just want to click on the preview. And we want to set up a password for this user. So we'll just say set new password. And we'll use our standard password or whatever password you want to set there. And we'll say confirm. And there we go, the user's been created and we're all good. And then just to show you the difference between what the admin dashboard looks like and a user dashboard, we'll log out. And then we'll log in with lab user at mm.local. And the password. Now you'll see the dashboard looks slightly different where we actually have some places here to manage cases, where we have alerts, tasks, other dashboard options, and so on, which we'll be going into more detail in future videos. We're going to wrap this video up at this point now that we have integrated both Cortex and the MISP with the Hive. In the next video, we're going to go a step further, and I will show you how to configure the threat feeds in MISP and how we can feed that information as alerts back into the Hive. And we're also going to look at how we can configure Cortex analyzers and use them to analyze our observables. If you found this video series useful, please don't forget to subscribe and click the bell notification button so that you'll be the first to know when I publish new videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all soon. Take care and cheers for now.